Welcome back to another AP World History video lecture, and this time we're going to be talking about maritime empires. I know, big sounding name. What do we mean by talking about that? So maritime is just another name for sea travel or sea trade. So here what we're talking about is really a switch from the time period from before. So from when we talk about 1200 to 1450 CE, we talk about land-based empires. A good example of that would be the Sui, the Tang, and the Song dynasties in China, or like the Aztec Empire in Mesoamerica, or the Songhai Empire in Africa. Now we're going to talk about maritime empires, or empires that were established based on sea trade and really sea conquering. And so here we're seeing a switch towards European empires. Okay, so European exploration started, as you remember, with the competition between the Portuguese and the Spanish. But these two empires ended up making some big errors that led to their demise. So we're going to take an example of that when we look at the Spanish. When the Spanish and the Portuguese kind of started settling back, they created a vacuum of power in which nobody was really in charge. And so this led to the rise of new maritime or sea-based empires. The French and the British were the ones who would fill in this vacuum, and they did so in order to build new trade routes in the Americas. Both of the empires would develop their trade routes surrounding the Mississippi River. Why is that the case? Well, the Mississippi connects Canada, North America, and the Gulf of Mexico and creates a whole new trade route. It's going to be really important. The new empires developed settlements that led to the trade routes of massive new products like tobacco, sugar, and cotton. At the same time, countries in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East would have to react to the rise of the European nations. They did this by limiting European trade, and they attempted to protect their traditional cultures. So here are three big things I want us to keep in mind during this lecture. Number one, European kingdoms were creating centralized nations that were being built upon investments into maritime or sea trade and settlements. Number two, kingdoms in the traditionally dominant areas of the world, including China, India, and the Middle East, still kept expanding their trade, and they attempted to limit the Europeans. And then number three, the expansion of new empires and settlements led to new forms of coerced and voluntary labor systems. Okay, so let's talk for a moment about the mistakes that Portugal and Spain made, especially Spain. Portugal and Spain, you might remember, expanded. Portugal did so into East Asia, Spain into Western Hemisphere. Portugal had one exception, that was Brazil. Spain is a really good example of the mistakes that were made. Spain really benefited from the exploitation of silver, especially within Mexico from the encomienda system. However, Spain made this huge error with the silver they got. They ended up using the silver to purchase items outside of the country, both from Northern Europe and China, and many of their wealthier citizens then bought within the country as well. This inflated the Spanish economy, while at the same time causing a massive outflow of Spanish gold to other countries. So the next major country to kind of rise and fill in that gap was the Netherlands. The Dutch ran their country like one large business. The most important service they provided was a banking one. They had banks throughout the country. This allowed the Dutch to develop their own state and to invest in their companies, probably the biggest one called the Dutch East India Company. This company established trade out to places like India and Southeast Asia. However, for this time period, this type of banking and investment system really misunderstood the true power of the time. Britain and France understood the power. So what was this power? They realized that what you have to do with your maritime or sea-based empires is you have to go out and fund and find colonies. And you use these colonies to then exploit natural resources like timber, tobacco, rice, dyes, cotton, and sugar. In order to get more out of these, a country needed to invest in their military so that they could expand and then get more colonial land. This new type of economy is going to be called mercantilism. So what is mercantilism? Under mercantilism, a country goes out and gets colonies. The colonies provide the mother country, like Britain or France, with a natural resource. Let's take an example like timber. Britain or France then take that timber and they make a finished product, like a ship. The mother country then attempts to sell these finished products to the colonies and to foreign countries. So why do they do this? Well, the profit that they get from these sales would go into the military, and that's important because then you want to go out and get more colonies, so you can get more resources, make more finished products. Now you might notice that there's a little bit of an issue here. If countries are constantly trying to invest in their militaries, and they get this by trading with other countries, why would I, a foreign country, want to trade with the country that's going to build up its military? And you're absolutely right. Foreign empires tried to stop buying from one another. So the big thing about mercantilism, and this is really important to understand, really important to remember, so take it down in your notes, is that the main purpose was to create a balance in which you have more exports, less imports. And that was the constant attempt by countries. Export your goods as much as possible, import as less as possible. Now, they couldn't completely cut off imports. There was some degree that they had to do imports, but they tried to really minimize it as much as possible. Both Britain and France attempted to use this system to take over more areas in North America. The primary area of trade and transportation was the Mississippi River. Why? At the northern end of the Mississippi River was the Ohio River Valley. This area had fertile land and widespread trade of fur. Traders could transport the trade down south to the Gulf of Mexico and out into the Atlantic Ocean for transatlantic trade. Portugal, the Netherlands, and Britain all attempted to also spread this trade out to Southeast Asia. The kingdoms of Eastern and Southeast Asia were not quite as open to giving the Europeans access to trade. Why? Well, in China, the dynasty at the time was the Ming Empire. The Ming had their own explorer, who had went out before the Europeans did. His name was Zheng He. Zheng He was an Islamic Chinese explorer. He took 300 ships with 10,000 men. He explored all the way to India, the Middle East, and Eastern Africa. But the leaders in Ming China got a little afraid. They were afraid that their investments into Zheng He's travels were going to bankrupt the economy and make it really difficult to protect against the northern invaders from the steppe region. So they put an end to his travels. Then on top of that, they started fearing external influence, especially from the Europeans. So they limited European influence in trade to just a few ports. A very similar thing happened in Japan as well in the Tokugawa dynasty. There, the Tokugawa dynasty feared outside influence. Japan had been invaded twice by the previous dynasty, the Mongol Yuan dynasty. In both cases, typhoons had stopped the invasions. However, the Japanese were really afraid of future possible invasions from outsiders, so they too limited the influence of Europeans to only a few ports. So the expansion of maritime empires led to settlements across the world. This meant new forms of labor. In Mexico, the conquered Aztecs were placed in slave-like conditions on encomiendas to exploit silver. Conquered Incas were placed into a Spanish mita system to build roads and infrastructure. Europeans sent their own poor to the settlements. These people were called the indentured servants. They came over in a system called the headright system, in which people who had settled in the colonies would pay for indentured servants to come over to these settlements, and then indentured servants would have to work for 7 years. At the end of that time, they would gain their freedom and they would gain land. Of course, this became a problem. As more and more indentured servants came over, there was less and less land available to them. So now Europeans began to look for another, less costly form of labor. And that's going to get us into the next major issue, which is the transatlantic African slave labor system. It gets really complicated because when we look at that, we're going to see it in the context of economic mercantilism, but then we're also going to get into this issue of race and racism as well. Okay, I'll see you in class.